The two closest friends and colleagues I had in life were John McCarthy and Marvin Minsky. And I met both, first Marvin and then John McCarthy, while I was still in the Air Force and working at the Air Force had assigned me to Hanscom Field to work with Lincoln Laboratory. And the Air Force sort of forgot about me. And I just did what I made myself useful, is that I was a very fast programmer. So I had a reputation for fixing problems because I could program faster than other people, or anyone, I guess. So the way I met Marvin was that when I came to MIT, they gave me an office, and there was another guy in the office. His name was Roland Silver. And Roland Silver said, "Hey, I have to introduce you to a good friend of mine, Marvin Minsky." So he introduced me to Marvin Minsky, and that's how I met him. The way I met John McCarthy was completely different. I had written a paper while I was in the Air Force about a new kind of memory system called tree memory, is what I called it, because it was related to information retrieval, and it had a tree-like structure. And while that tree is spelled, the tree structure tree is spelled T-R-E-E, and in retrieval it's T-R-I-E, I decided to call my paper Tree Memory with a T-R-I-E or T-R-E-I, whichever, no, which is it? I don't know. I can't spell. Anyway, I just named it with the other way so that people would be cognizant that it was somewhat unusual, which it was. So I asked around to people, is this an idea that other people have thought of? Is it an old idea? I was a newcomer to the computer field, and lots of ideas I did think of, I quickly found out were old ideas that someone else had thought of 10 or 20 years before. Okay? In some cases, they thought of it just, a year or two before. So in my wanderings, someone said, your tree structure sounds a bit like what John McCarthy's been working on, called list structure. And I knew about list structures and knew it wasn't relative, but they said John McCarthy was someone I could talk to and find out if this idea was any good or if it was an old idea or what. Okay, so I decided to talk to him. Well, John McCarthy was then a professor of electrical engineering at MIT, which was strange because I knew he was a mathematician. Okay, so I was told I could go to MIT and somewhere in a particular area near their IBM computer at the time, I would find his office. So I went there, I found his office, and I found he wasn't in his office, but there was a secretary there. And I said, "Well, is John McCarthy here?" And she said, "Well, he's somewhere." And I said, "Well, I have an appointment. I want to talk to him." And they said, "Well, he's out in the hallway somewhere near the office. You'll find him there." So I went back into the hall, and I'm looking for him. And I see fairly far away a guy who's walking. He's walking away from me. And I think, I don't know if that's him. But he's walking in a sort of slow way. He came to a stop, and he turned around and started walking the other way. And then he stopped and turned around and started walking back. So I went up to him and said, "Are you John McCarthy?" And he turned around and he said, "Oh, yes, I'm him. Why?" And I said, "Well, I've written a paper and I want someone to look at it and tell me if it's new or old or good or bad or something." Okay. So he said, "Okay," and I gave him the paper. So what did he do? He took the paper, he turned around and started walking away. But But then my feelings weren't hurt because I'd been seeing him walking back and forth all the time. So he walks away, stops, and he's turning, this paper was about 4 pages long. He's turning the page, and he walks back slowly. And when he comes back, he takes the paper and he sort of shoves it back to me like he's disgusted. And I thought, oh, this is stupid. It must be that this is old hat. And I said, well, tell me something. And he said, well, he said, the trouble is, it's original, but I had the same idea myself a while ago, but I never wrote it up. So basically, it's your idea. And so that was how I met him. And we became very good friends until he died. Long time later.
But we also want to talk about Minsky.
Yeah, okay. Minsky. So I'm trying to think how I met Minsky. I met Minsky because he was a friend of Rollo Silver, and Rollo was my office mate. And so I met Marvin, and right away we became friends. And not long after meeting Marvin, I got out of the Air Force. And by the way, when I say we became friends, we used to have get-togethers at each other's houses. They'd be at Marvin's house, or he lived then in Cambridge. I forget the street, but I know where it is. And John McCarthy lived somewhere else. But in any case, both of them were married, and they each had some children. In Marvin's case, I think he had one then. And so what happened, hold on a second, I was trying to think.
So you're having these get-togethers, and
Yeah.
you meet him in Cambridge, you become friends.
Yeah, right, yeah, okay. So the three of us were, really enjoyed each other's company, and we liked talking about things and technical stuff and so on. So when I left the Air Force, I got a job at Bolt, Beranek and Newman, and working for a guy named Licklider. And Licklider said to me, we should hire some more people. And I said, can we hire some part-time? He said, sure. They're called consultants or something. So I quickly offered jobs, got BBN to offer jobs to Marvin Minsky and John McCarthy. So now we were all there doing the same things. So when I came up with the idea of cellular automata, I told it to Marvin right away. And he told me, well, he said, there's some papers on this. There's one the first paper is by a famous physicist, one of the first, and the guy who thought of the digital computer, the stored program computer. Up until then, every computing machine they'd made hadn't thought of the idea of, in the memory where you had the data, there was the instructions for the computer. The early ones were just built to like an adding machine, to add, subtract, multiply, and divide. But the data was in the memory. And so the idea of putting the instructions in the memory was thought of by von Neumann, and it's called the von Neumann architecture. And von Neumann was a famous physicist who worked on the hydrogen bomb and things like that. So I'm getting off.
So you wanna, this is more from Minsky, a tribute to him, that his family watches years from now and goes, you know, your friendship with Minsky, but you're talking more about what Minsky was doing more than what you're doing. You know, more Marvin, what a great guy.
Okay. Well, Minsky.
So start
Okay.
with something like
Okay.
Marvin Minsky and I were great friends. And so
Okay. Marvin Minsky and I were very good friends, and I had a company called Information International, and Marvin ran the AI lab at MIT. So we had an informal pact and a deal, which got implemented about at least a dozen times. One of Marvin's students would get stuck. And he would be working and, on some thesis, AI thesis typically, and he would get stuck, which was very common. Marvin felt that when a person was stuck, you shouldn't berate them and you shouldn't push them and so on. You should change something. So the standard change would be he would tell them, go to work at Information International for a while, my company, and I would hire them. So one after another, these various people, sometimes 3 or 4 at the same time, worked in my company, which had an office in Los Angeles and an office in right near MIT in Cambridge. We had 2 offices. Okay. So some of the experiences were kind of amazing. One of the best students Marvin ever had was a guy named Martin. I don't remember his first name right now. And Martin came, he was working on, I think he was working on Maxima, which was the predecessor to Mathematica, the first attempt to get a computer to do mathematics in general. And so Marvin, he got into trouble, but the trouble is he was working so hard, he stopped producing, And so Marvin told me to hire him temporarily, so I hired him and sent him out to Los Angeles and gave him a job to do there. And the same thing happened with that. He worked and worked on this job and got it all sort of almost done, but he couldn't finish it. I would travel back and forth every so often. This is Bill Martin. So I went out there once, and Bill Martin explained how he'd gotten almost everything done, but he had written it in Fortran and the machine compiled it. He wrote the whole system out before he compiled any of it. And when he compiled it, it was too big for that computer. So he was spending all his time struggling, trying to figure out how to squeeze some code down and so on and so forth. So I told him, listen, just go back, call Marvin and tell him you're coming back to MIT, and go back to MIT, I'll finish this for you. Because he had done such a great job of everything. So I finished it easily because all I did was divide it up into pieces, and because this machine was one of the first with a tape drive, of the film readers with a tape drive. So this was a job we were doing for the Atomic Energy Agency and for the Lawrence Radiation Lab. And so that job got finished. They called this machine the eyeball or something like that. And it was used to analyze the results of all the nuclear tests that were being done underground. It worked like a charm. And so that's an example of this role. And I would say there's 7 or 8 other senior graduate students who got transferred by Marvin to Information International for a period of time, and then they went back to MIT and finished. Okay, I want to say something more. I know. Oh, wait. I know. So one case, a similar case, was one of my programmers suddenly said to me, I want to get a PhD. And I said, oh my God. This was a great programmer, and he was basically a mathematician. But like a lot of mathematicians, he was a self-taught mathematician. He'd never gone to college. So I said, you know what? He said to me, I want to go to college and get a PhD. I said, you know what that means? Normally, you have to go to undergraduate school, then to graduate school, then you have to be a postdoc, and then you do this, that, and the other. And finally, they'll give you a PhD, and then you maybe can, a few years later, you'll become a professor, you know. And so he was all depressed about that. So I told his story to Marvin. And Marvin said, okay, tell him to contact me. So he contacted Marvin. Next thing I know, he's a graduate student at MIT. He'd never been to college. In fact, he'd never been to high school. Okay, now I went to Marvin and said, Marvin, how the heck did you do this? Because when he went there to MIT, they said, well, first of all, you want to get a doctorate, you know, you have to go step A, B, C, D. Okay, and now he was, you know. So what Marvin said, well, I lied and told him to apply to the, when he applied to MIT, they said, where's your high school diploma? And he said, oh, I don't have that either. So they said, go away and get it and come back in a few years, you know. Okay, so I already said that, but okay. So what happened is, I suddenly find he's a graduate student at MIT. And I said, Marvin, how did you do that? And Marvin said, well, I brought him to the graduate admissions committee, and they didn't think to ask if he had a high school diploma. Of course not. Anyway. Okay, whatever.
Yes, okay.
But just give me a short version of your relationship with Marvin. Just
Okay.
you and me. Marvin and
Okay.
I have been best friends.
Okay.
Don't
Okay.
give me any examples, just
Okay,
a
okay,
wonderful
okay,
relationship.
okay.
And Marvin
So,
and I.
so we were very different, but we were very understanding of each other, okay? And so we were great friends. You know, I considered him my best friend, and I think he had maybe more friends than me, you know. And John McCarthy and Marvin and I were kind of trios much till, and then John left and went to Stanford eventually. The story of John's leaving is very interesting too.
But keep it to Marvin. I guess because Marvin's
Well,
family is doing a video about Marvin.
Okay, well this involves Marvin.
Okay.
Okay. So there's a meeting I arranged at that was held in Los Angeles, and I invited Marvin and John McCarthy to come. And Marvin and I sort of collaborated on a method of convincing everybody there to decide what we wanted them to decide, which was an interesting way to run a meeting. Okay. So anyway, after the meeting, John said he was going to leave MIT, and both Marvin and I were very surprised, and we said, why? And he said, well, MIT wants me to leave. And we said, how do you know? And he said, well, the first step is you're an assistant professor in computer science. And, you know, then, you know, Marvin wasn't in the electrical engineering department. He was in the math department, which I always thought was crazy because John McCarthy was a mathematician and he was in the electrical engineering department. And so that was sort of weird. And Marvin certainly wasn't a mathematician, but he was in the math department back then. No. So he was in electrical engineering, and he wasn't an electrical engineer either. So anyway, I want to, just a second, I want to think.
Yeah, we want to talk
Marvin,
about Marv.
yeah, I know. I know what I want to say, just a minute. Okay, so this is about Marvin, but this is an interesting thing, and John McCarthy's involved. So at this meeting, John McCarthy told Marvin and I that he was going to MIT, where he had been a kind of star undergraduate, and he was going to apply to Caltech. No, he was going to go to Caltech, where he'd been a star undergraduate, and he was going to go there and see if they would make him a professor. We wondered why he was leaving MIT, and he told us because they didn't promote him, which that promotion means if you don't get it, it means get out before we throw you out. Okay. So both Marvin and I thought MIT was crazy to get rid of this guy, but we also felt sorry for him, and Marvin suggested that we accompany him to Caltech for moral support. So, and so what happened is, and the other fact is, wherever I went in these meetings, I always rented a car. None of the other MIT people did. So I was the only one with a car. So Marvin and John McCarthy and I all went to Caltech. So Marvin had his interview while John and I sat around, and he came out and said, they're not interested. So I'll try Stanford next. So this poor assistant professor who had been a star at Caltech sort of took its clue from MIT. If MIT wanted to be rid of him, why do we want him? So he went to Stanford. Here's what Stanford did. They said, oh, come to Stanford. You'll start out as a full professor with tenure and blah, 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 and this and that and the other. And they just treated him royally because he'd been a graduate student there, and they knew him too also. So anyway, that was Caltech's and MIT's stupidness, which is something Marvin had to put up with, more so than I. And Marvin's putting up with it was part of his battle at MIT. His first battle was that he wouldn't let the AI lab be part of the computer science lab, because if he lost that independence, there would just be the computer science people deciding who would stay and who would go. And he had all these strange ways of dealing with people that were effective and logical to me. So he resisted that until basically they forced him to leave and come. He went to the media lab. And why did he go to the media lab? Because all you had to do was to call this architect who ran it. In those days, it was part of the architecture school, and convince him, And so Marvin was a free agent there. It was kind of sad and stupid that MIT sort of lost him to the main campus, and he went to the media lab. And there, they didn't bother him, let him do whatever he wanted. But also they didn't support him as they should have, in my opinion. So, okay.
You think you got enough?
What?
You think you got enough of Marv?
No. Just a minute. Okay, let me say something more about. Okay. One of the the fantastic things about Marvin was the...
A little bit.
Okay.
I like where you started.
One of the most fantastic... Okay. One of the most fantastic things about Marvin was his sort of disregard for some of the rules of the university and his imaginative ways of overcoming them to achieve a great result. You know, one of the examples is with Bill Hemingway, where he got him admitted to the graduate school, and but that's just one. And the wonderful thing about Marvin is he would recognize a student for what his capabilities were, not what his pieces of paper were. So a student could come to him with no background, no degrees, no A's or thesis or what, okay? And he could recognize this person is someone we ought to support. I wanted to give one example.
You already gave it.
I want to give another.
Okay. Let's start with one good example is the time.
One of the best examples is this. I was in Marvin's office talking to him about a book. Oh, one of the nice things about Marvin is every so often he realized I needed a little more education. He would recommend something for me to read. So he recommended I read a book called Men of Mathematics. So I read it, and then I came back and I'm sitting in Marvin's office and I say, okay, Men of Mathematics by E.T. Bell. It's a wonderful book, and all it is about the lives and achievements of mathematicians, okay?
Hold it a little over.
Okay, so I read it, and now I'm having a meeting with Marvin, and we're talking about it. And one of the stories here is that all these mathematicians, a lot of them, were never recognized. And they wandered through a terrible life with their fantastic theories, and everyone was rejecting their ideas, and they had a horrible time, and finally they died. And then people began to pick up their ideas and say, hey, this is one of the greatest guys ever. So that was, a lot of the people have histories like that. So after reading the book, I met with Marvin, and I say, Marvin, I don't know anyone who does great work all the time or has brilliant ideas and is never recognized. Do you? And he thinks, and he says, no, I guess maybe those days are past. And we're talking about this subject just like that, when there's a fierce knock at Marvin's door. So I get up, open the door, and in comes this guy, a bit crazy right away. And he's exactly the type of person, completely unrecognized and would never be recognized, okay, while alive. And he's just spouting crazy things, but they're all brilliant. And so both of us are a bit stupefied by this character who just marched in, you know. But he's the guy we were talking about to each other in this book. Okay, so Marvin immediately said, let's offer him a job, you know. So that meant I had to hire him somehow. So I did, and he was Patrick Gunkel. Gunkel was a great, brilliant crackpot. And he did amazing things, but he was a crackpot and uneducated, but still he did amazing things, okay? So with Marvin, we used to conspire to support him. And I have to say, one of the last interactions I had with Marvin was Marvin wanted, we supported Gunkel, who died
a few years before Marvin.
Yeah, a couple of years before Marvin. You know, he eventually, we found him different appointments, first at MIT, and then, you know, he got driven out of MIT by being so obnoxious, and then he wanted to go to England, and he went to England, and there threw him out after a while too, and then he came back and he hung around Princeton for a while, and and so on and so forth. And so the last thing, one of the last interactions I had with Marvin says to me, "Hey, Gunko is now in a particular circumstance, and he's in need of some money, and we have this fund at MIT. Marvin and I had, I had a fund, and Marvin said, because he knew what I did financially and things like that. So I had created a fund at MIT where I, from time to time, wanted to support a graduate student and so on, and then I would just do it. And then my accountant said, hey, it should be your foundation that does this, not you or something. So I had the foundation do it. Then one thing after another, we decided to create an account at MIT where my foundation would put in a whole bunch of money, and then it would sit there at MIT. I would call this guy up who was the treasurer, and he would allocate the money for some project. So one of the last things in Marvin's life was he found out that this person, Gunkel, was back on hard times. He'd moved around a lot, and he had gone down to Princeton for a while, and then he came back and was living on Cape Cod, and he was in financial trouble. So he came to me and said, Ed, do you have any funds left in that account? And I said, yeah, there's about $30,000 left in it. And he said, well, we hadn't done anything for so long. It had been maybe 10 years since we had used the account. He said, why don't we use this to save Gunkel? Okay. So I said, okay, we'll use it that way. So I called MIT, and the person I normally called was the treasurer. And he had died. So they had a new treasurer. So I called him, and he said, I don't know anything about this account. I thought, oh, what's going on? So what happened is we couldn't get that money out. And once when I was on vacation, a guy who worked for me wanted to use some of the funds to support one person, and he signed he called me and said, could he do this? And I said, yeah. And so he signed a little bit of money. Okay. So it turned out everybody that I had dealt with for many years, and Marvin had dealt with them too, was either dead or died or gone. So Marvin's idea to support him never happened and didn't work because MIT couldn't believe that this account, which Marvin and I had arranged, was for the purpose which we told them. So they said to us both, you guys are lying. You want to steal this money, and it's not yours. And we're going to give it to this other guy. And if you want to use it, contact him. So I contacted him and explained things to him, and he said, look, they've already told me that you guys are liars and that's not your money, so go to hell. That's basically what he told us both. So that was that.
Okay, cut.
So
That's more me than Marvin, I